Our marriage had been suffering for some time, so my wife and I decided to rent a cabin in the Smoky Mountains for 3 weeks, hoping the distance from our normal lives would help us fix things. And for the first week, it actually felt like it was working. But then one morning, looking back at it now, 6 months later, it is strange how hard it is to pinpoint the exact week things started to slide. When you're in the middle of a marriage, you don't keep a log of the exact moment a conversation becomes just a little bit shorter, or when looking at your partner becomes more about checking a box than actually seeing them. It all just blends together into the background noise of everyday life. Rachel and I were good together for a very long time. We met at a mutual friend's engagement party in Virginia Highland. I was 29 then, working as a junior architect, and she was 27, just starting to find her footing in a digital marketing agency. I remember she was wearing a dark green dress, and she was standing by the food table, looking slightly bored by the corporate small talk happening around her. I went over, made some completely uninspired joke about the catering, and she laughed. It wasn't a polite social laugh either. It was real and a little loud. We ended up sitting on the back porch for 3 hours, ignoring everyone else, talking about everything from our terrible first apartments to how much we both hated driving on I-85 during rush hour. We dated for 3 years, and those years were easy. I know people say relationships take constant, grueling work, but with us, it didn't feel that way at first. We liked the same independent movies, we had a shared rhythm on weekends, and we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. If I had a rough day with a demanding client or a budget overrun at work, knowing I was meeting Rachel for tacos later made the whole afternoon manageable. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near Piedmont Park after 2 years of dating, and even the process of combining our furniture, which usually breaks couples apart, was mostly just a lot of bad jokes and takeout on the floor. When I proposed, it wasn't a grand cinematic production. We were just walking back from a late dinner on a crisp October night, and it felt like the most logical, natural next step in the world. We had been married for about 18 months when all of this happened. Our wedding was a relatively small affair, mostly family and close friends, and our first year as husband and wife was genuinely happy. We talked about buying a house eventually, maybe having kids in a few years, and we spent our weekends exploring small towns outside Atlanta or just lazying around the apartment. There was a real connection there. We were a team, and I never had a single doubt that she loved me, just as she never had a reason to doubt how I felt about her. But then the second year of marriage hit, and life simply started to get heavy. It wasn't a sudden betrayal, a hidden addiction, or some massive screaming argument. It was much more mundane than that, which in hindsight made it harder to fix. My architectural firm landed a massive commercial contract for a new mixed-use development downtown. Suddenly, my standard 40-hour weeks stretched into 50, then 60. I found myself staying at the office until 7 or 8 in the evening, sometimes just staring at blueprints on my monitor until the lines blurred together. Rachel's career was shifting too. She was promoted to a senior marketing manager position, which meant she had more stability and regular office hours, usually getting home by 5:30 or 6. But it also meant she was carrying a lot more mental exhaustion. She was managing a team of younger creatives, dealing with demanding corporate clients, and sitting through endless strategy meetings. The result was a slow, physical shift in our daily routine. Rachel would get home, change into comfortable clothes, and either make something simple for dinner or order something. By the time I finally unlocked our front door at 8:15, the energy in the apartment was already spent. "Hey," I'd say, dropping my laptop bag by the entryway. "Hey," she'd reply from the couch, her laptop open on her knees or her phone in her hand. "There's leftover pasta in the fridge if you're hungry." "Thanks. How was your day?" "Fine. Just long. Yours?" "Busy. The structural engineers are backing us into a corner on the parking deck." That sucks. And that would be it. I'd heat up the food in the microwave, eat it standing up at the kitchen island while scrolling through my emails, and she would keep watching whatever show she had on the television. We weren't angry with each other. We were just exhausted. The conversations became transactional. We talked about whose turn it was to buy groceries, when the HVAC filter needed to be changed, or what time we needed to leave for her parents' house on Sunday. We stopped talking about how we actually felt, mostly because by the time we had the chance, neither of us had the breath to spare. The distance started showing up in small, silent ways. I'd noticed the way she began pulling her legs up under her on the couch, creating a physical barrier between us where we used to lean into each other. When we went to bed, we stayed on our respective sides of the mattress. It wasn't an intentional snub. It was just that twisting over to hold someone required energy that felt impossible after a 12-hour day. Sometimes the frustration would leak out in tiny, petty friction points. I remember one Tuesday evening in late October. I came home later than usual, around 9, because a concrete pour had gone wrong on a job site. I walked into the kitchen and saw that the dishwasher was full of clean dishes and there was a stack of dirty pots sitting in the sink. Rachel was in the bedroom reading. I went into the bedroom trying to keep my voice flat, but the exhaustion made it sharp. "Rachel, did you run the dishwasher today?" She looked up from her book, her eyes blinking in the lamplight. "Yeah, I ran it before I left this morning." "Could you have emptied it? I've got these dirty pots from last night, and the sink is completely overflowing." Rachel stared at me for a long beat. She didn't yell. She just closed her book carefully and placed it on the nightstand. "I worked a 9-hour day today, Matthew. I came home, made myself dinner, cleaned up after myself, and wanted to read for 30 minutes before I go to sleep. If the pots are bothering you, you can empty the dishwasher and put them in there. I've been on a construction site since 7 this morning," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I just wanted to walk into a clean kitchen. And I want a husband who doesn't come home at 9 o'clock every night looking for things to complain about," she said quietly. She didn't argue further. She didn't slam a door. She just turned off her bedside lamp, rolled over to face away from me, and pulled the blanket up to her shoulder. I stood there in the dark hallway for a minute, feeling a mix of hot anger and a cold, hollow weight in my stomach. I went back to the kitchen, emptied the dishwasher in total silence, washed the pots, and went to sleep on the edge of the bed. The next morning, we both acted like it hadn't happened. We drank our coffee, said our goodbyes, and went back to our respective offices. But the incident didn't disappear. It just settled into the foundation of the house, making everything a little more unstable. We started avoiding topics that might cause tension, which meant we stopped talking about anything real at all. If a movie we watched had a plot about a couple drifting apart, I'd look at the floor. If she brought up a friend who was going through a divorce, I'd offer a quick, safe comment and change the subject. We were both actively participating in a silent agreement to pretend everything was fine, because admitting it wasn't fine meant we'd have to find the energy to fix it, and neither of us had anything left in the tank. By November, the emotional distance felt like a physical presence in our apartment. We were roommates who happened to share a bank account and a legal document. We still went out to dinner occasionally on weekends, but the dinners felt rehearsed. We'd talk about the menu, comment on the decor of the restaurant, discuss her brother's upcoming wedding, and then we'd sit in silence while waiting for the check, both of us staring down at our water glasses. I would look across the table at her, seeing the familiar slope of her jaw, the way she tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking, and I would feel this terrifying realization that I didn't know what she was thinking anymore. And the scariest part was, I could tell she was doing the same thing to me. She would look at me when I was talking about a project deadline, her eyes tracking my face, but her mind was clearly miles away, trapped in her own internal monologue. We were drifting, and we both knew it, but we were too polite or too cowardly to say it out loud. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday night in mid-November. I had managed to leave the office early for once, getting home around 6:30. Rachel was already there, sitting at the kitchen island. She didn't have her laptop open. She didn't have the TV on. She was just sitting there with a mug of tea that had gone cold, staring out the window at the rain hitting the balcony. I set my keys down on the counter. The sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet apartment. "Hey," I said. She turned her head slowly. She looked incredibly small in the dim light of the kitchen. Her eyes were tired, surrounded by faint dark circles that makeup hadn't quite covered that morning. "Hey," she said. "You okay?" I asked, walking over and putting a hand on her shoulder. The fabric of her sweater was soft, but her muscles were completely tense underneath. "Not really," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any anger or drama. It was just heavy. I let my hand drop and took the stool next to her. "What's wrong? Work?" "No," she said, looking down at her cold tea. She traced the rim of the mug with her index finger. "Not work. Us." My chest tightened instantly. That was the sentence we had both been avoiding for 6 months. My immediate instinct was to defensively deflect, to protect the fragile status quo we had built. "We're just in a busy season, Rachel. My project wraps up its first phase in January, and your Q4 campaigns will be over soon. We just need to get through the holidays. We've been saying we just need to get through this month since the spring, Matt," she said, finally looking up at me. Her expression wasn't angry, she just looked worn down. "It's always the next deadline, or the next budget, or the next family event. Meanwhile, we don't even talk anymore. I don't remember the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about schedules or logistics. I'm working hard for our future," I said, the words feeling defensive even as they left my mouth. "I know you are," she said quickly, reaching out to touch my arm. Her hand was warm, and for a second I felt a flash of the old connection we used to have. "I'm not blaming you. I'm really not. I'm working too much too. We both are. But we're losing each other, Matt. Surely you feel it too." I looked away from her, staring at the dark reflection of the kitchen cabinets in the window. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell her she was being dramatic, that every married couple goes through dry spells, that we were fine. But I couldn't. The silence in the apartment was too loud, and the distance between us on the couch every night was too real to ignore. "Yeah," I admitted quietly. "I feel it." Rachel let out a long, ragged breath, her shoulders dropping slightly as if a massive weight had been lifted just by hearing me say it. "I don't want us to become one of those couples that stays together just because it's easier than splitting up," she said. "I love you. I really do. And I want this to work." "I want it to work too," I said, and I meant it with everything I had left. I didn't want to lose her. The thought of our marriage failing scared me more than I wanted to admit. Then we need to do something drastic, she said. She grabbed her phone, unlocked it, and turned it toward me. I was looking at this today during lunch. On the screen was a listing for a rental property. It was a secluded log cabin tucked away in a densely wooded area near the Great Smoky Mountains, about a 4-hour drive north of Atlanta. The photos showed a rustic, simple interior with exposed wooden beams, a small kitchen, a single large bedroom, and massive glass windows that looked out directly into miles of empty forest. It looked incredibly isolated, far away from any major highways or bustling tourist towns. "A cabin?" I asked, looking from the screen back to her face. "A real break," Rachel said, her eyes pleading with me. "No work, no laptops, no driving to the office at 7 in the morning, no distraction from friends or family or errands. Just us, in the middle of nowhere, for 3 weeks. We have the vacation time saved up. We can take December off before the final holiday rush. We can just focus on being a couple again. We can talk. We can hike. We can cook meals together. We can find whatever it is we lost." I looked at the photos of the isolated cabin again. The idea of leaving my project for 3 weeks made a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. The firm would be stressed, my email inbox would accumulate thousands of messages, and my clients would be annoyed. But then I looked at Rachel. I looked at the desperate hope in her eyes and the quiet exhaustion etched into her face, and I realized that if I chose the project over this, I might not have a marriage left to come back to come January. "3 weeks is a long time," I said softly. "We need a long time, Matt," she replied. "A weekend trip won't fix this. We need enough time to actually clear our heads and remember who we are when we aren't working ourselves to death." I took a deep breath, reached out, and placed my hand over hers. "Okay," I said, "let's do it. Book it." A small, genuine smile broke across Rachel's face, the first real smile I had seen from her in weeks. She leaned over and pressed her forehead against my shoulder, holding onto my arm tightly. For the first time in months, the heavy, suffocating silence in our apartment felt a little lighter. We spent the rest of the evening talking about the logistics of taking the leave, what clothes we needed to pack, and how nice it would be to see the mountains in the winter. We genuinely believed that getting away from our normal lives was going to save us. We thought that the pressure of the city and our jobs was the only thing tearing us apart, and that if we could just isolate ourselves in the woods, the love we used to have would naturally fill the empty space again. At the time, we honestly thought we were giving ourselves a chance. We had no idea what that trip was actually going to bring out of us. The morning we left Atlanta, the weather was standard for early December, gray, damp, and lingering right around 40 degrees. Packing the trunk of my SUV felt more like preparing for an expedition than a 3-week vacation. We had heavy coats, thick blankets, hiking boots, boxes of dry groceries, and a massive cooler filled with enough meat to last us at least the first 10 days. I remember locking the front door of our apartment and feeling a sudden physical lightness in my chest just from hearing the deadbolt click. We hadn't even left the parking garage yet, but the mere fact that I wasn't driving toward the downtown connector for another grueling week of client meetings felt like a massive victory. The drive north on the highway was quiet at first. For the first hour or so, the ghost of our daily routine still hung over us. I kept checking my mirrors out of habit, braced for the usual aggressive perimeter traffic, and Rachel spent the first 45 minutes answering her last few work emails on her phone, her thumb clicking against the screen in a fast, rhythmic pattern. But once we passed through Clayton and crossed the state line into North Carolina, the landscape began to change drastically. The endless strips of fast food joints, gas stations, and car dealerships gave way to rolling hills, which quickly turned into steep, rocky ridges covered in bare gray trees and patches of dark green pine. Rachel finally locked her phone and dropped it into the center console between us. She took a deep, ragged breath, let her head rest against the seat back, and looked out the passenger window. "That's it," she said, her voice sounding a little lighter than it had in weeks. "No more emails." "Are you sure?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the winding two-lane highway as it began to climb. "You won't get an emergency notification about some year-end marketing campaign?" "I turned off the push notifications entirely," she said. "If the agency burns down, they have my supervisor's number. For the next 3 weeks, I'm completely unavailable." I reached over and placed my hand on her knee. She didn't pull away or shift her posture. Instead, she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through mine. We drove like that for the next hour, watching the mountains grow larger and more imposing against the horizon, the silence between us finally shifting from awkward and tense to something genuinely comfortable. The GPS on my dashboard completely lost its signal about 20 minutes before we reached the property, forcing us to rely on the printed directions the owner had emailed to Rachel. We turned off the paved state road onto a narrow, unpaved gravel lane that snaked upward through a dense canopy of bare oaks and poplars. The gravel crunched loudly under our tires, and the incline was steep enough that the SUV had to downshift, the engine whining slightly in the absolute quiet of the woods. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked exactly like the online photos, only smaller and more embedded in the landscape. It sat on a small, cleared ridge, entirely surrounded by miles of sloping forest. The exterior was built from thick, dark-stained logs with a wide-covered front porch that faced out toward the valley below. I turned off the ignition, and the sudden lack of engine noise was almost jarring. There was no hum of a distant highway, no sirens, no city rush. Just the sound of the wind moving through the high pine needles and the steady ticking of my car's cooling engine. Rachel unlocked her door and stepped out onto the gravel, inhaling deeply. "God, it smells incredible up here, just pine and cold air." "It's definitely isolated," I said, opening the trunk to begin unloading. We spent the next half hour hauling our gear up the wooden steps and into the house. The interior was simple, rustic, and clean, dominated by a heavy wooden structure. The front door opened directly into a combined living room and kitchen area. There was a stone fireplace in the corner, a worn leather sofa, and a thick wooden dining table near the kitchen counter. The entire back wall was made of massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked straight out into the woods, making it feel like the forest was a permanent part of the room. Off to the right was a short hallway leading to the only bedroom. It was small but comfortable, containing a queen-sized bed covered in a thick, quilted blanket, a plain wooden dresser, and a large standing mirror with a dark oak frame that sat in the corner opposite the bed. I didn't pay much attention to the mirror then. It was just a standard piece of heavy furniture, reflecting the gray afternoon light coming through the bedroom window. "This is exactly what we needed, Matt," Rachel said, walking into the kitchen and setting a box of dry groceries on the counter. She was already looking more animated than she had in months. The pale, drained look she usually wore after a long day at the office was gone, replaced by a slight flush from the mountain air. "Let's get the heat turned up and get settled," I said, finding the thermostat on the wooden wall. "Then I'll see about getting a fire started." By the time the cabin warmed up, The sun had already dropped behind the western ridges, plunging the woods outside into a deep, impenetrable blackness. Without streetlights or city glare, the darkness outside the large windows was total. We kept dinner simple that first night, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup out of a can. We ate at the wooden kitchen island, sitting on high bar stools. Back home in Atlanta, we would have had the television playing in the background or our eyes glued to our respective screens. But here, the only sound was the crackle of the wood burning in the fireplace and the occasional rattle of the window panes when the wind picked up. "It feels strange not checking my phone every 5 minutes," Rachel admitted, holding her mug of soup with both hands. "My thumb literally twitches toward my pocket every time there's a pause." "Don't do it," I smiled, taking a bite of my sandwich. "Let's see how long we can go without looking at them." "I'm serious, Matt. Let's leave them on the kitchen counter. Only use them if we need to check the time or if we're driving into town." "Deal," I said. After dinner, we washed the dishes together in the small porcelain sink. I dried while she washed. It was a chore we used to bicker about at home, usually involving complaints about who left what in the sink. But in the quiet of the cabin, the routine felt peaceful. We didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like we were both just catching our breath, letting the frantic, anxious energy of our normal lives slowly drain away. When we went to bed, the bedroom was cold, so we crawled under the heavy quilt and stayed close together for warmth. For the first time in months, she didn't immediately roll over to her extreme side of the mattress and turn her back. She rested her head against my chest, and I held her shoulder, watching the dim embers of the fireplace cast faint, orange shadows on the wooden ceiling through the open bedroom door. It wasn't a passionate, dramatic breakthrough, but it was a start. It felt human. The first week settled into a noticeably calmer, slower rhythm than anything we had experienced in our entire married life. Without the jarring buzz of an alarm clock at 6 a.m, we woke up naturally whenever the sun cleared the eastern ridges, usually around 7:30 or 8. Our mornings became my favorite part of the day. I would get up first, throw a pair of sweatpants on, and head into the kitchen to make coffee in the old drip machine. While it brewed, I'd rebuild the fire from the night before, blowing gently on the coals until the dry kindling caught. By the time the cabin smelled like wood smoke and fresh coffee, Rachel would wander out of the bedroom, wrapped in a large fleece blanket, her hair messy and her eyes small with sleep. We would sit by the big windows for an hour, drinking our coffee and watching the woods wake up. We saw a family of deer cross the clearing on the third morning, their gray coats blending perfectly into the brush. We didn't talk about work, deadlines, or our financial goals. Instead, we talked about the books we wanted to read, or memories from our childhood, or just made fun of the absurdly loud woodpecker that took a liking to the oak tree right outside the bedroom window. By afternoon, we would put on our heavy layers and go for long hikes. There was a trail system that started just a quarter-mile down the gravel road, winding deep into the national forest. The air was crisp and biting, making our breath cloud in front of us as we walked. On Wednesday, we took a particularly long trail that led up to a rocky overlook. The climb was steep, and by the time we reached the top, we were both sweating despite the 40-degree weather. We sat on a flat boulder, sharing a bottle of water and looking out over the endless ridges of the Smokies, stretching out into a blue-gray haze in the distance. Rachel leaned her head against my shoulder, her breathing slowly leveling out. "I forgot how massive everything is out here," she said quietly. "In the city, You spend all your time looking at things that are 10 feet in front of your face. Monitors, dashboards, windshields. You forget there's an entire world that doesn't care about your schedule. Yeah, I said, putting my arm around her waist and pulling her a little closer. It makes your problems feel pretty small. She didn't answer right away. She just watched a hawk glide on a thermal over the valley below. Sometimes small is good, she murmured. We walked back down the mountain, holding hands, our boots crunching in unison on the frozen dirt and dry leaves. The physical exertion was doing us good. The constant low-grade physical tension I usually carried in my neck and shoulders from sitting at a drafting table all day was completely gone. I felt loose, tired in a healthy way, and completely present. About midway through the week, we ran low on fresh produce and milk, so we took the SUV and drove 20 minutes down the mountain to the nearest town. It wasn't a tourist trap with neon signs and souvenir shops. It was just a quiet, historic mountain community with a brick courthouse, a hardware store, a small local grocery, and a couple of diners. We spent an hour wandering through the aisles of the grocery store, picking out ingredients for a beef stew we planned to make that night. In Atlanta, grocery shopping was a hurried, stressful chore, usually done late on a Sunday evening while fighting through crowded aisles and worrying about the upcoming work week. Here, we took our time. We argued playfully over which kind of potatoes to buy and picked up a loaf of fresh sourdough bread from a local bakery section. Afterward, we stopped at a small coffee shop off the main square. It had low ceilings, mismatched wooden chairs, and smelled intensely of roasted beans and cinnamon. We sat by the window, watching the occasional local truck pass by outside. Rachel looked across the small wooden table at me, a genuine, easy laugh escaping her lips as I told her a ridiculous story about a contractor I had worked with who accidentally ordered 300 pink bathroom tiles instead of beige. Wait, so he actually installed them? She asked, her eyes crinkling at the corners. He installed 50 of them before the client walked onto the site and nearly had a stroke, I laughed. She laughed again, a full, unprompted sound that I realized I hadn't heard in months. Hearing it filled me with a sudden, sharp wave of relief. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a profound sense of hope. The emotional distance that had felt so insurmountable in our apartment seemed to be evaporating out here in the mountain air. The woman I had fallen in love with wasn't gone. She had just been buried under layers of stress and routine, and the vacation was doing exactly what she had hoped it would do. It was bringing her back to me. By the end of that first week, the atmosphere in the cabin was undeniably lighter. The sharp edges of our communication had softened completely. The small, recurring arguments about household chores, lateness, and unexpressed frustrations had vanished entirely. Without the daily triggers of our hectic Atlanta lives, there was simply nothing to fight about. Rachel seemed remarkably relaxed, her shoulders dropped, her smile coming more frequently and naturally. On Friday evening, the beef stew we had bought ingredients for was simmering on the stove, filling the wooden kitchen with a rich, savory aroma. I was standing by the large glass windows, watching the twilight turn the woods outside into a deep, dark blue. Rachel walked up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind and pressing her cheek against my shoulder blade. "Smells good," she murmured. I turned around in her embrace, looking down at her face in the dim kitchen light. "The trip was a good idea, Rach. You were completely right. We needed this." She looked up at me, her eyes soft, reflecting the yellow light from the kitchen stove. "I'm glad we came, Matt. I really am." I kissed the top of her head, feeling a deep, solid sense of satisfaction. I genuinely believed our marriage was healing. I interpreted the calm, the easy smiles, and the lack of daily friction as a definitive sign that the structural foundation of our relationship was snapping back into place. What I didn't realize then, what I wouldn't understand until much later, was the distinction between an improved atmosphere and resolved problems. We were enjoying each other's company again, which was beautiful and real, but we still hadn't actually talked about the deeper issues that had driven us to this cabin in the first place. We hadn't addressed the months of drifting, the emotional withdrawal, or the quiet walls we had built between us. We were simply enjoying the luxury of a truce, protected by the isolation of the mountains and the lack of external pressure. But standing there that night, with the warmth of the fire at our backs and the scent of dinner in the air, I didn't care about the logistics of the past. I was just happy. I felt a cautious, growing optimism that the storm had passed, and that the next 2 weeks would just be a continuation of this peaceful, easy recovery. I went to bed that night feeling safer than I had in a year. I had no idea that the first week was over and that the quiet was about to end. By Tuesday of our second week, the easy rhythm we had found at the cabin felt completely natural. After dinner, Rachel was curled up on the leather sofa finishing her book, and I was sitting at the heavy wooden dining table looking over a few printed floor plans, just passing the time. There was no pressure, no unsaid tension hanging over the room. Around 11 o'clock, we turned off the lamps, watched the last logs in the fireplace fade to gray embers, and went to bed. Rachel fell asleep almost instantly, her hand resting against my side. I followed her into sleep a few minutes later, listening to the absolute stillness of the mountains. I woke up at a little past 7 the next morning. The sun was just breaking over the eastern ridge, cutting through the bare trees and throwing long, thin shadows across the wooden floorboards of the bedroom. Rachel hadn't moved. She was still buried under the heavy quilted blanket, breathing softly. I slipped out of bed quietly, pulled on a fleece pullover, and walked out into the main living area. The cabin was cold. I knelt by the stone hearth, cleared away the morning ash, and threw a handful of kindling and 2 split logs onto the remaining coals. Once the smoke cleared and the wood caught, I went into the kitchen to start the coffee machine. Our phones were sitting exactly where we had left them, plugged into the dual charger on the far end of the kitchen counter. We had been doing a good job of ignoring them all week, but out of pure habit, wanting to check the morning temperature forecast before we planned our day, I reached over to unplug mine. The screen lit up. There was a single text notification. It was from Rachel. I blinked at the screen, looking back down the short hallway toward our dark bedroom. There was no movement from inside. Rachel was still asleep. I unlocked the phone and opened our text thread. The message had been delivered at 2:54 a.m. The text didn't look like spam or a random network error. It read, "Hey, I know this is random, but I need to tell you something. Remember that Wednesday last month when I told you the creative review ran until 7? It didn't. I wrapped up everything by 4 o'clock. I stayed at my desk in the empty office for 3 hours because I just wanted some time alone and I wasn't ready to come home yet." I read it 3 times. The casual lack of capitalization at the beginning of the sentences, the shorthand phrasing. It looked exactly like the texts Rachel used to send me from her office, but the content made my stomach drop slightly, not because it was a devastating revelation, but because it was so utterly specific and deeply personal. The coffee machine finished brewing with a low hiss. A moment later, I heard the sheets rustle in the bedroom, and Rachel walked out into the kitchen, wrapped tightly in her fleece blanket. Her hair was messy, her eyes half closed against the bright morning light. "Hey," she mumbled, reaching for a coffee mug. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice flat. I held up my phone. "Did you use your phone last night?" She paused, her hand hovering over the cabinet handle. She looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "Last night? No, I went to sleep when you did. Why?" "Look at this," I said, handing her the device. Rachel took the phone, squinting at the screen as she read the message. I watched her face closely. I expected her to laugh, or tell me it was a delayed text from months ago, or even ask if it was some weird joke I was playing. Instead, her expression just stayed blankly confused. She read it through a second time, then handed the phone back to me. "That's really bizarre, Matt," she said, her voice completely level but deeply perplexed. "I didn't write that. Are you sure it isn't an old draft or something that got stuck in the network?" I asked. "The service up here is pretty terrible." "No," she said, shaking her head. She walked over to the counter and picked up her own phone, unlocking it. "I've never typed anything like that out, ever." She opened her messages and clicked on my name. I leaned over her shoulder to look. There, at the very bottom of our conversation thread, was the exact same text message. It had a timestamp of 2:54 a.m. sitting inside a blue scent bubble on her screen. "See?" I pointed at her phone. "It's right there in your sent history. Your phone says you sent it." Rachel stared at the screen, her thumb scrolling up slightly to see our previous texts from days ago, then back down to the early morning timestamp. "I don't know what to tell you, Matt. I was dead to the world at 3 in the morning. I didn't get up, and I didn't send this." "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice grounded and rational. "But what about what it says? Did that actually happen?" Rachel looked up from her screen, her eyes clear and direct. "I mean, yes, I remember that Wednesday. It was mid-November, right before we started planning this trip. I did stay late at the office until 7, and I told you it was because the creative review ran over. But it did run over, Matt. I was stuck in a conference room with the regional team until 6:30, and then I stayed behind to finish my minutes. I didn't sit at my desk for 3 hours just to avoid coming home to our apartment." "So the day is real, but the reason is wrong?" I asked. "Yes," she said firmly. She wasn't getting defensive or angry. She just sounded like someone trying to solve a frustrating technical riddle. "I have never stayed behind at work because I didn't want to see you. I wanted to come home. This whole message is completely wrong." We stood there in the kitchen for a couple of minutes, both of us looking down at our screens. It was an impossible thing to rationalize. I thought about data corruption, or maybe some strange glitch at the cellular tower down by the highway, routing someone else's text through her number. But the fact that it perfectly referenced a specific Wednesday where she actually did stay late made that explanation feel incredibly thin. "Maybe someone at your office is messing with you," I suggested, trying to find an alternative, like some weird spoofing app. "Nobody at my office has access to my phone, Matt," she said, setting her device back down on the charging pad. "And definitely nobody knows the specific nights I tell you I'm staying late. It doesn't make any sense." "Yeah, it doesn't." Rachel sighed, pouring herself a cup of coffee and leaning against the wooden counter. "Look, it's obviously some kind of digital freak accident. Technology acts completely scrambled out here in the mountains. Let's just ignore it. I don't want to spend our morning staring at a phone screen." "Right," I said. "You're right, it's just a glitch." I plugged my phone back into the charger next to hers and tried to push the thoughts out of my head. We went through our usual morning routine, sitting by the large glass windows and talking about driving into town to get some lunch and look around. Rachel was acting completely normal, laughing at a story about her coworker, and the air between us felt just as light and comfortable as it had all week. But as I drank my coffee, I couldn't stop looking across the room at the kitchen island. The confession itself was small. It wasn't devastating, but the sheer impossibility of it kept turning over in my head. A network could delay a message, but it couldn't invent a specific, believable lie using my wife's exact texting style and place it into her sent folder while we both slept. I felt a faint, cold prickle of uneasiness settle deep in my stomach, a quiet realization that something completely unexplainable had just entered our space. I brushed it off, smiled back at my wife, and told myself it was nothing. But for the first time since we had arrived at the cabin, the isolation of the woods didn't feel entirely peaceful. 2 days passed without another incident, and I had almost managed to convince myself that the first message was just a freak network anomaly. Then Friday morning arrived. When I picked up my phone from the kitchen counter, I saw another text notification from Rachel. It had been sent at 3:07 a.m. My stomach dropped. The message read, "Hey, I know this sounds bad, but I need to say it. Remember those times last autumn when you texted me saying your meetings ended early and you'd be home by 5? Every time you sent those, I felt this heavy flash of disappointment instead of being glad. I just really look forward to having the apartment to myself for a few hours. And when you came home early, I felt trapped the second you walked through the door." It sounded exactly like Rachel. A few minutes later, she walked into the kitchen. I didn't say a word. I simply turned the phone around so she could read the screen. The moment she finished reading it, the sleepiness disappeared from her face. "Matt," she said quietly, "I didn't send this. Check your phone." Rachel picked up her phone. A few seconds later, she set it back down. The message was there too. "I don't understand," she said. "I was asleep all night." "Were you?" The question came out before I could stop it. Rachel looked at me, hurt flashing across her face. "Yes, Matt, I was asleep." I looked at her for a few seconds, and as much as I wanted a simple explanation, I believed her. She didn't look guilty. She looked scared and confused. "But then how is this happening?" I asked. "How is your phone sending me things you don't remember typing?" "I don't know," she said, "but I didn't send it." I stared down at the message again. "What about what it says? Is it true?" "No." Her answer came immediately. "Things were stressful last fall, but I was always glad when you came home early. I never wished you weren't there. This isn't true." "It's the second time, Rachel." "I know." She rubbed her forehead and looked away. "It has to be some kind of glitch, or somebody messing with my number. I honestly don't know." Neither did I. The conversation died there, because we'd already gone through every explanation we could think of after the first message. None of them made any more sense now than they had 2 days earlier. Rachel took her coffee into the living room. I stayed behind, staring at the 2 phones sitting side by side on the counter. By themselves, the messages weren't devastating. What bothered me was the pattern. Both had arrived during the same narrow stretch of the night. Both sounded exactly like Rachel, and both focused on private feelings connected to our marriage. I still wanted a logical explanation. I still believed there had to be one. But for the first time since arriving at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening wasn't random. and that was far more unsettling than the messages themselves. By Sunday morning, the fragile optimism we had managed to scrape together after the second text had completely eroded. We were still playing the part of a couple on a relaxing mountain vacation, but the silence inside the cabin had changed. I had kept my phone powered down for an entire day, but not knowing was making me restless. I turned it on just long enough to check. The text notification appeared almost instantly. The timestamp read 2:51 a.m. Hey, I need to say this. Remember your firm's regional dinner back in August? The one where I stayed home and told you I had a migraine? I wasn't sick, Matt. I lied because I just couldn't handle the thought of putting on a dress, sitting at a table with your coworkers, and spending 4 hours pretending everything between us was perfectly fine. The performance felt too heavy. I stood by the kitchen counter, staring at the screen. This wasn't about wanting a little space or a quiet evening alone. This one hurt. I walked straight into the living room and held the phone out to Rachel where she sat on the couch. She took it and read the message. I watched the color drain from her face. She didn't even reach for her own phone this time. Neither of us needed to check. We both knew it would be there. I didn't send this, Matthew, she said, her voice low and sharp. I didn't write it. It's from your phone, Rachel. Same kind of message. Same time of night. I don't care about the time, she said, looking up at me. I had a real migraine that night. You remember that? I stayed in a dark room for hours. You bought me ginger ale and crackers. I didn't lie to you then, and I am not lying to you now. Then why that specific dinner? I asked. Why would this message mention that? I don't know, Rachel said. Her jaw tightened. But it's not true. I wanted to support you. I wasn't pretending. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Turn yours off, I said, holding down the power button until my screen went black. We're not checking them again, not out here. Rachel didn't argue. She turned hers off too and shoved it into her bag. I walked back to the heavy wooden table and sat down, staring out through the large glass windows at the gray, skeletal trees. The cabin was completely silent. A few days earlier, that silence had felt peaceful. Now it didn't. By Sunday evening, I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. 3 messages had arrived from Rachel's phone in the middle of the night. Every one of them had been personal. Every one of them had sounded exactly like her. And every time, she swore she hadn't sent them. I didn't know what was happening anymore, but I knew one thing. I needed to see it for myself. That evening, while Rachel sat on the couch with a book open in her lap, I decided I was going to stay awake. I didn't tell her. If I wanted to know whether Rachel was somehow sending those messages herself, the last thing I wanted was for her to know I was watching for them. So I kept everything the way it had been. After Sunday morning, we had both kept our phones turned off and away from us unless we absolutely needed them. That night, I left mine on the kitchen counter like usual. Rachel's was there too. I could have kept my phone beside the bed, but that wasn't the point. I wasn't trying to catch the message. I was trying to see whether she got up and sent it. Just before going to sleep, I set a silent alarm on my smartwatch for a little before 3 in the morning. When it vibrated against my wrist that night, my eyes opened immediately. Rachel was asleep beside me. I stayed completely still. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Nothing happened. Eventually, I slipped quietly out of bed and walked into the kitchen. My phone was exactly where I had left it on the counter. No new messages. Rachel's phone was still sitting beside it. Everything looked normal. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling slightly embarrassed. Then I went back to bed. The following night, I tried again. Just before bed, I checked the alarm on my watch twice to make sure it was set correctly. Rachel noticed. "You're checking that thing a lot. I don't want to oversleep tomorrow." She accepted the answer without questioning it. A little before 3 in the morning, the watch vibrated against my wrist again. My eyes opened instantly. For a few seconds, I didn't move. The cabin was silent. Rachel appeared to be asleep beside me. I stayed completely still. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing happened. The entire situation suddenly felt stupid. I was exhausted, lying awake because of a handful of text messages. I started convincing myself that I had built the whole thing up in my head. Maybe the messages really were some bizarre technical issue. Maybe being isolated in the mountains was making me overthink everything. I was seconds away from closing my eyes when I felt the mattress shift. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle movement beside me. Every muscle in my body locked instantly. I had deliberately gone to sleep facing away from Rachel, toward the edge of the bed. Slowly, without moving anything except my eyes at first, I turned my head just enough to look back over my shoulder. Rachel was sitting up in bed. For a second, I honestly thought I was still dreaming. She hadn't gotten off the mattress. Her legs were still on the bed beneath the blanket, but her upper body was upright. Then her hand moved toward the space beside her pillow, and a faint rectangle of light appeared. Her phone. My heart started hammering. The phones were supposed to be outside in the kitchen. We had turned them off ourselves. Yet there it was, lying right beside her. She started typing, not scrolling, not checking the time. Typing. Her thumbs moved steadily across the screen. I could only see part of her face from the side, and even that was mostly hidden by her hair, which had fallen forward over her cheek. I couldn't tell what she was feeling. I couldn't tell if she looked awake. I couldn't even tell if she knew what she was doing. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I simply watched. After several seconds, she stopped typing. She placed the phone on the mattress beside her, pushed the blanket away from her legs, and slowly got out of bed. The movement was quiet. She walked across the room toward the standing mirror in the corner. There was enough pale light coming through the window for me to see her outline. She stopped directly in front of the mirror. Then she leaned forward. Both hands rested on either side of the frame. Her forehead touched the glass. She remained like that for several seconds. I couldn't tell what she was doing. Then she straightened up, turned around, walked back to bed, picked up the phone, set it beside her pillow, and lay down. After a few minutes, her breathing settled back into a slow, steady rhythm. I remained frozen. I lay there listening to her breathing and trying to process what I had just seen. Watching her type should have answered everything. Instead, it raised even more questions. The part I couldn't figure out was the phone. When we went to bed, both phones had been sitting in the kitchen. When my watch woke me up, Rachel was asleep beside me. I hadn't heard her get out of bed. I hadn't heard her come back. But when she sat up, the phone was already right beside her. That meant she had gotten up at some point, gone into the kitchen, grabbed her phone, brought it back into the bedroom, and gotten back into bed. And somehow I had missed all of it. A few minutes later, once I was sure she was asleep, I carefully slipped out of bed. The bedroom suddenly felt different. Not dangerous, not threatening, just wrong. As I crossed the room toward the door, I found myself looking back over my shoulder every few steps. Rachel hadn't moved. I reached the doorway and looked back again, still asleep. I don't know why I kept checking. Part of me was afraid that if I turned around, she'd be standing right behind me. My phone was still sitting on the kitchen counter where I'd left it. I picked it up and turned it back on. There was a new message from Rachel. I opened it. The message was longer than the others. It read, "Hey, I think I've been avoiding this for months because I didn't want to admit it, even to myself. I keep telling myself that we're just stressed and that things will go back to normal when life settles down. But I don't think that's the whole truth anymore. I still care about you, Matt. I always will. But I don't know if I'm still in love with you. I've been pretending that feeling is still there because I wanted it to be there. I wanted to believe it would come back if we just worked harder or waited long enough. But every time I force myself to act like everything is fine, it feels less honest. I don't know when it changed. I don't know why it changed. I just know I'm tired of pretending that I still feel it." I read it once, then again, then a third time. The cabin was completely silent. I could hear the refrigerator humming softly behind me and the wind brushing against the outside walls. I stood there staring at the screen, trying to convince myself that the message meant nothing, that it was another lie, another impossible confession. But after what I had just witnessed in the bedroom, that certainty was gone. I walked back toward the bedroom and stopped in the doorway. Rachel was asleep, exactly where I had left her. Her breathing was slow and steady. The phone rested beside her pillow. Looking at her now, I would have sworn she had been asleep the entire night. I got back under the covers, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel sitting up in bed with her phone in her hands. By the time the first pale light appeared through the bedroom window, I hadn't slept at all. The next morning, I was already awake when Rachel opened her eyes. I hadn't slept at all. For a few seconds, she just lay there under the blanket, blinking against the pale morning light coming through the bedroom window. Then she rolled slightly onto her side and looked at me. "Morning, honey." I didn't answer. The smile faded from her face almost immediately. She pushed herself up onto one elbow and studied me more carefully. "Matt, what's wrong?" I stared at her for a few seconds. "Really?" She frowned. "What? You don't know what happened last night?" The confusion on her face looked genuine. "No. What happened?" A long silence followed before I finally said it. "I saw you." Rachel blinked. "What do you mean?" "I woke up during the night. I saw you sitting up in bed with your phone and walk over to the mirror." The color slowly drained from her face. "Babe, no, I was asleep." "Then how did your phone get beside you?" She froze. "What?" I pointed toward the pillow. "It's right there." Rachel turned, saw the phone lying beside her, and for the first time that morning, she looked genuinely scared. "Wait," her voice dropped. "How did it get here?" "Exactly. That's what I want to know, Rachel." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she glanced toward the mirror, standing in the corner of the room. "I don't remember any of that." "Really?" She looked back at me. "Yes." "You seriously don't remember getting up?" "No." "None of it?" "No." I got out of bed, walked into the kitchen, grabbed my phone, and came back. Without saying a word, I handed it to her. The longer she looked at the screen, the paler she became. When she reached the end of the message, she handed the phone back. "I didn't send this." I sat down on the edge of the bed. Forget how it got sent. Forget the mirror. Forget all of it. She looked away immediately. I swallowed. "Just tell me one thing." The room felt completely still. "Is what that message says true?" The moment the words left my mouth, something changed in her expression. She pushed the blanket aside and started to stand. "I can't do this right now." She moved toward the bedroom door. "I'm getting coffee." I stood up and gently caught her by the arm before she could leave. Please don't walk away." She stopped but still wouldn't look at me. A long silence followed. Then I said quietly, "Look at me." Slowly she did. I could feel my chest tightening. "Especially the last one," I whispered. The tears appeared almost instantly. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then her face crumpled and she covered her mouth with one hand. The resistance seemed to leave her all at once. She sat back down on the edge of the bed and started crying, not loudly or dramatically, but like someone who had been carrying something heavy for far too long. "I'm sorry." The words came out broken. "I'm so sorry, Matt." I sat down across from her and waited. For a while, she couldn't speak at all. Her shoulders trembled slightly as she tried to steady her breathing. Every time she seemed close to regaining control, another wave of emotion hit her. "I didn't want to feel that way," she finally whispered. Her voice cracked. "I really didn't." She wiped at her eyes and stared down at the floor. I kept telling myself it was stress, work, the apartment, the fighting. I kept telling myself it was just a rough patch and eventually it would pass. I thought if I waited long enough, things would go back to normal. A tear rolled down her cheek. Then she continued, "But it never really went away." The room was completely silent except for her uneven breathing. There were days I'd stay at work longer than I needed to, not because I had to. I just wanted a little time to myself before coming home. And there were times you'd text me saying you were getting out early. She paused and shook her head. I hate even saying this out loud, but sometimes I wasn't happy about it. I just wanted a few more hours alone. She looked away, clearly ashamed of the words as they left her mouth. And that dinner. A sad, embarrassed laugh escaped her. I didn't exactly have a migraine. I had a slight headache, sure, but that wasn't really why I stayed home. The truth is, I just didn't want to go. I was tired of pretending everything was fine. Tired of smiling and acting like everything between us was perfect when I wasn't even sure how I felt anymore. She wiped at her face again and took another shaky breath. For several seconds, she just stared down at her hands. Then she looked up at me, her eyes red from crying. "I never wanted to leave you, I swear." Fresh tears appeared. "I wanted this to work. I really did. That's why I suggested this trip." She glanced around the cabin, and when we got here, I honestly thought it was helping. For the first time in months, I thought maybe we were finding our way back. A long silence followed. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The worst part is that every one of those messages was saying something I'd been trying not to admit to myself for a long time." She swallowed hard. "But I swear to you," her eyes met mine, "I don't remember sending any of them." For a while, neither of us said anything. Then I looked down at the phone still sitting in my hand. If all of that's true, then who sent these? Her expression changed immediately. The sadness remained, but now there was fear too. "I don't know." The words came out barely above a whisper. "I swear to you, I don't know." "And the mirror?" Her eyes widened. "I don't remember it." "You don't remember getting up?" "No." "Using your phone?" "No." "Standing in front of the mirror?" "No." Every answer came immediately. She wasn't hesitating. She genuinely seemed to have no memory of any of it. And somehow that scared me more than the confessions themselves. A long silence settled over the room. Eventually, she looked toward the window and said quietly, "I want to go home." I nodded. I had been thinking the exact same thing. Neither of us said it directly, but we both knew. The vacation was over. We left the cabin that same day. Neither of us argued about it. Neither of us tried to convince the other to stay. We packed our bags in near silence, loaded everything into the SUV, and started the drive back to Atlanta almost a week earlier than planned. The trip home felt strange. Most of the time we just sat quietly, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Every now and then, one of us would say something about gas, traffic, food, or directions, but neither of us brought up the messages, the mirror, or anything that had happened during the trip. There wasn't much left to say. The conversations that needed to happen had already happened. That was 6 months ago. We're still together. We didn't separate. We didn't file for divorce. We didn't magically wake up one morning with all our problems solved either. We're still working on it. Some days are better than others. Some conversations are still difficult. There are things we're both trying to heal from, and trust takes time to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, we're at least being honest with each other. That alone feels like progress. Even now, we still find ourselves talking about that cabin from time to time, usually late at night when one of us brings it up and the other wishes they hadn't, because no matter how much time passes, neither of us can explain what happened there. I know Rachel sent those messages. I watched her do it with my own eyes. But I also believe her when she says she has absolutely no memory of any of it. Rachel doesn't have a history of sleepwalking. She doesn't have any medical condition that would explain it. And in the 6 months since we came home, nothing even remotely similar has happened again. So all we're left with are those same unsettling questions. If Rachel wasn't consciously sending those messages, then who was? How did those messages know things that only she could have known? Not facts, not dates, not events, feelings, private thoughts she had never said out loud. And then there's the cabin itself. Nothing like this had ever happened before we went there. Did that cabin have anything to do with it? I still don't know. All I know is that our marriage survived. Those questions didn't.